All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Massachusetts Historical Society. My name is Canisoran Wall Street Channelai. I am the Director of Research here at the MHS, and it is my pleasure to welcome all of you in person as well as online to the 2024 Conrad E. Wright Research Conference at the MHS. Before we begin, there are a number of people we need to thank for making this possible. First, the Honorable Levin H. Campbell, whose generous contribution has endowed these conferences in honor of Conrad Wright, the former Director of Research and Sibley editor, who is with us today. Hello, Conrad. I would also like to thank the steering committee members for this conference. First among them is the inspiration for this conference, Lila Teeters-Knoll. Lila, where are you? It's there, right in front. One of our research fellow alumni who gave me the idea for this years ago, before the pandemic even. So we hope we've made you proud with what we've got here today. The other committee members are Professors Danielle Battisti from the University of Nebraska, Omaha, Sunu Kodumthara, who's from Southwestern Oklahoma State University, also moderating our keynote panel today, Benjamin Railton from Fitchburg State University, Brendan Rinsink from Brigham Young University, Marcia Zug from the University of South Carolina School of Law, and Alyssa Tardif, who is the MHS's Director of Education. I want to also thank Dean Barbara Krauthammer for coming up from Emory for this program, and also Professor Robert Allison from Suffolk University, who is allowing us to use the facilities there for our full day of the conference tomorrow. Thanks also to the MHS staffers who made this possible, as well as our wonderful summer intern, Maggie Herman from Mount Holyoke College. And the biggest thanks to Cassie Cloutier, the Assistant Director of Research, who makes all research programming possible. So thank you. After I introduce our keynote panelists, our steering committee member, Dr. Kodumthara, will moderate a discussion between them. We shall reserve about 15 minutes for Q&A from the audience members at the end of the program. If you are in the room, simply raise your hand and Maggie will come around with the microphone. Please speak into the microphone so our friends online can hear us and or hear you. And if you are online, just simply type your questions into the Q&A box and Cassie will read them on your behalf. For those of you who are unfamiliar with us, the Massachusetts Historical Society is the first historical society in the nation. We are home to 14 million manuscript pages and counting. We grow by about 150 linear feet every single year. We are an expanding research library that allows scholars to tell a global history through a Massachusetts lens, since Bay Staters were just about everywhere and witnessed history in all times and places since the early Republic and the colonial era before. The MHS is free and open to the public, so if you have not been here to use our collections, we invite you to explore what we have. But the MHS is more than just a research library. We are also a table around which people who are interested in history have found a place to discuss the past, big issues, big topics about the past. We have 7 seminar series that run over the course of the academic year. These are free and open to the public. They revolve around a pre-circulated paper. So come learn about the latest scholarship in African-American history and environmental history and the history of women, gender, and sexuality in early American history, and much, much more. But for questions that are bigger than a single seminar paper can cover, we convene conferences every 2 years as well that we help to organize here. And what more intriguing question to ask than who are we? Who are we as Americans? Who are we as the citizens of a republic? And any discussion of citizenship opens the door to questions about the nature of the nation to which those citizens belong. The papers presented in this conference remind us that citizenship has benefits, that citizenship has burdens, that citizenship has power, and as such, it is wielded as a tool to liberate and to oppress. We discussed this theme at the centennial of 2 pivotal pieces of legislation, the Indian Citizenship Act, and the Immigration Act, also known as the Johnson-Reed Act. And we are truly honored to have with us three leading scholars to start our conversation about the themes, the time period, and the issues leading up to those pieces of legislation. First up, we have Maurice Crandall. He is a citizen of the Yavapai Apache Nation of Camp Verde, Arizona, as well as an associate professor of history at Arizona State University. He is the author of These People Have Always Been a Republic, Indigenous Electorates in the U.S.-Mexico Borderlands, 1598 to 1912, which won both the 2020 Coe Western History Prize for the most distinguished book on the history of the American West and the Western History Association, and from the Western History Association, and the 2020 Weber Clements Prize for the best nonfiction work on Southwestern America. Kunal M. Parker is a professor of law and associate dean for intellectual life and dean's distinguished scholar at the University of Miami's School of Law. He is the author of multiple works, including Making Foreigners, Immigration and Citizenship Law in America, 1600 to 2000 from Cambridge University Press, as well as the essay Civic Longing, The Speculative Origins of U.S. Citizenship, published in the Journal of American History. Samantha Seeley is an associate professor of history at the University of Richmond. Her book, Race, Removal, and the Right to Remain, Migration and the Making of the United States, won the 2021 Merle Curdy Award for Best Book in American Social History from the Organization of American Historians, and the 2021 John Jurdy Prize for the Best Book in Midwestern History from the Midwestern History Association. The key questions that motivated the Indian Citizenship Act and the Immigration Act still resonate today. We are still debating immigration. We are still debating native rights. We are still debating citizenship. We are still debating the nature of America. So for the next couple of days of this conference, we invite you to learn about, to ponder, and to debate where we have come from, who we are, and perhaps dream about who we might become. Dr. Kodumthara, over to you.
Thank you, Kid. So my responsibility is just to moderate. And so I am going to sit back and allow our esteemed scholars to take it from here. We're going to begin with Dr. Crandall. Maurice?
I'm happy to be here today. It's nice to be back to the East Coast. I lived in Vermont for 5 years, from 2017 to 2022. I taught at Dartmouth College during that time, and I was there on the cusp of going up for tenure. And essentially what happened was that ASU came in and said, do you want to come back to Arizona? And I said, yes, please. People always ask, how do you live in that weather there? I'll take, 4 months of summer hell over 9 months of winter hell. And I'm a desert person. I'm from Arizona, and so that sort of heat and landscape and all of that is in my blood. I have a few slides to show today. So as was stated in my introduction, I'm a citizen of the Yavapai Apache Nation of Camp Verde, Arizona, which is a small tribal nation in central Arizona. If you've ever been to Sedona, that's our ancestral homeland. Although it's not part of our tribal land holdings. When we were given a reservation in the early 20th century, they intentionally left out the best areas and kept those for themselves. So I'm going to just show you a handful of slides that relate to Indian citizenship. We're 100 years of birthright citizenship in the United States, and sort of try to connect all these things together. So the first is to tell you who I am, because this is important. And in an Indigenous community, you need to say who your relatives are so that people know who you are and a little bit about you because of that. I'm the son of Jane Russell Wineski. This is my mom. She was the chairwoman of the Yavapai Apache Nation 2 chairs ago. I'm the grandson of Ned Russell, who was also chairman of the Yavapai Apache Nation. And then I don't have a photo, but my uncle, Vincent Randall, who just passed away, was our tribal historian and Apache culture director, and also served as our chair for a number of years, which is basically just to say that I come from a family of tribal politicians, aunties, uncles, cousins, other people, all serving on tribal council or as the chair of the tribe. And so people say sometimes, do you aspire to tribal leadership? The answer is no, not right now. But I do have fond memories of growing up in that sort of milieu. And I've written about this a little bit in my work. When I was a kid, my grandfather used to take me to council meetings. And if you've ever anybody here been to Cliff Castle Casino in Camp Verde, Arizona? Anybody? Not even Brendan? You've never been there? You've been there? Okay. We haven't been in it. So we have a casino, but at that time, this was in the 1980s, we didn't have a casino. The tribe, didn't have a lot of resources. We basically relied on federal appropriations and grants for any kind of programs or anything that we had. And so our tribal council chambers were in a trailer, and my grandpa would take me there and he would just say, go keep yourself busy in the corner while they had a council meeting. But I would listen in and kind of hear, all those things that were going on. And it instilled in me this interest in tribal politics. So as I said, we're a small nation. We have about 2,600 tribal citizens and less than 2,000 acres of reservation trust land. Tribal politics, though, are a big deal, sort of playing an outsized part in comparison to our size as a tribal nation. One of my uncles is currently running for council. And on Monday, my last full day in the office before leaving for this trip, I was coordinating trying to get family members who live out of state to send in their absentee ballot requests, because you can vote absentee. And it's not uncommon that a tribal election will be decided by just a handful of votes. I've even seen it happen where it was decided by one vote. So the reason that we get so wrapped up and excited about tribal elections is the same for any political body. The stakes seem exceptionally high, especially when with a small community like that. The intensity of tribal politics also is compounded by the fact that usually the person that's running is somebody that you grew up with or is a relative. So imagine if every election in the United States, the person running for president is someone you went to high school with, or somebody that you played basketball with, or some kind of relative that or a person who's also an enemy that you have, sort of a long-standing grudge with, or that your family doesn't like. That's basically what happens every single time. And our voter turnout, it fluctuates just like in, mainstream American politics. Sometimes we have low levels, but one recent election a couple of cycles ago, we had 70% voter turnout, which is that's unheard of in most elections. So anyway, what does all this have to do with Indian citizenship or citizenship broadly, the theme of this conference? Well, a lot. While I have seen passionate political participation in our own tribal community, I've seen a lot less of that in municipal, state, and federal elections. To put it very bluntly, most Native people, at least in my community, and I know in a lot of other communities, don't really care about municipal and state elections. Just for an example, a friend of mine, one of our tribal citizens, was elected to the local Camp Verde school board, where she's still currently serving. First tribal citizen to ever be elected to the local school board. My mom served on our local town council, which includes both the reservation community and the neighboring non-Native community. But examples like that are exceptionally rare, at least in our community. And I think that it extends beyond that as well. If you look at the entire history of Native political participation in the United States, less than 24 Native people have served in either House of Congress total. And if you look at the list, most of them have come from Oklahoma. Charles Curtis, who was a citizen of the Kaw Nation, famously served as vice president in 1924 when the Indian Citizenship Act was passed. And now we have Deb Haaland of Laguna Pueblo, who's our current Secretary of the Interior. I'm sure you're all aware of that. But by and large, for Native Americans to ascend political ladders outside of their own communities is very rare. And some of this has to do with historical, structural, and political barriers. I mean, that's without question, such as a lack of birthright citizenship until 100 years ago. But the other thing is that a lot of it has to do with a lack of political interest within Native communities. And there are a lot of causes for that. How many of you know how Deb Haaland cut her teeth politically? Does anyone know how she got into politics outside of Laguna Pueblo? Okay. She became politically active during the 2004 John Kerry presidential campaign. Maybe a lot of you weren't around for that, but I can remember that election very well. This is what she said. She said, "I would go into the campaign office, ask for a list of Native voters around the country, and cold call them." Then during the 2008 Obama campaign, she took, quote, "a carload of people and we'd go canvass in a Native American community every evening." And her main motivation for this was to get out the vote in underrepresented communities, her words, which in New Mexico are Native American communities. Here's a slide of Deb Haaland. Can you see the shirt that she's wearing? You see what it says? It says voting is sacred. So think about that. Voting is sacred. And then this is a recent flyer that the Fort McDowell Yavapai Nation, which is one of our sister tribes, it's sort of on the outskirts of Phoenix near Scottsdale, that was to increase voter registration for the Arizona primaries. The reference in this flyer is to two tribal citizens in 1948 who took Maricopa County to court over the denial of voting rights, and eventually it was overturned at the Arizona Supreme Court and opened the door for Native people to vote in Arizona, even though Indian citizenship had been in place for 24 years. But the reason that I show you these two things is here you have voting is sacred, and here it says honor our elders, register to vote. So the implication here is that we honor our elders by voting, but then the converse would be true. If we don't vote, we're dishonoring our elders. Every few years, there are significant campaigns to register Native American voters and increase voter turnouts, rock the Native vote. I see it every election cycle. And they can yield significant results. They can be important, like in Arizona, where the Native vote helped turn Arizona for Biden. So, again, it's undeniable that there are still significant barriers to Native American voting and political participation. But the fact that I want to point out is that we need these rock the vote drives, rock the Native vote drives again and again because of something else, a historical hesitation on the part of Native peoples to participate in politics. Just last month, I was talking to my cousin, whose mom was my grandfather's sister. And my grandfather, as I previously stated, was a tribal politician, but was also very civically engaged outside the community. His sister, who passed away in 2016, never voted once in her life. And my cousin was telling me this. She never voted in an election. She didn't trust the system. She had no interest in voting in a municipal or state or larger election. And while I don't have any scientific data to back this up, I'm fairly confident that the same could be said for a lot of other tribal citizens in the United States. Again, putting aside real barriers, structural, political, historical barriers to political participation, a lot of Native people have seen citizenship and the vote as a double-edged sword. And I've argued that citizenship and the franchise in particular, the conventional wisdom is when we're armed with the vote, then we can secure our political interests and safeguard our communities. But for Native people, citizenship and enfranchisement have had other meanings. As citizens of sovereign tribal nations recognized by the federal government to have certain rights to self-government, the most important form of citizenship has always been tribal citizenship. And citizenship in the municipality or the state or the nation have been viewed as threatening tribal citizenship. So instead of citizenship and the vote safeguarding your community and its interests, citizenship and enfranchisement have been used to erode tribal sovereignty and to get rid of the distinct status of Native peoples as citizens of tribal nations. Historically, especially before 1924, once you were a citizen and voted, you forfeited any claim to tribal citizenship. And that was sort of the prerequisite to doing that, to becoming a citizen. So just sort of to wrap things up, a number of Native American political leaders opposed citizenship historically, and we need to recognize this, or at least its unilateral imposition by the federal government. These included people like Pablo Abeda of Isleta Pueblo or Clinton Ricard, who was of the Tuscarora Nation, famously stated when the Citizenship Act was passed that it was a, quote, violation of our sovereignty. Our citizenship was in our own nations. So basically, in addition to measures meant to increase Native American voter turnout and remove barriers to full political participation, what I also propose are more measures to strengthen tribal sovereignty, to secure the political and economic well-being of tribal nations within the United States, and even a respect for Native peoples who don't participate in those types of political institutions. I just don't think that we need this sort of shaming of honor your elders, and if you don't vote, then you're dishonoring your elders, or the vote is sacred. I think that we can come up with better ways to talk about citizenship, and somebody who does not want to engage in, a colonially imposed institution, such as, the United States government or a state government or a municipal government, that should be respected and seen as valid as well. So that's it. Thank you.
To everyone for putting together this panel, and to my co-panelists and commentator. So I study North American migration, broadly conceived, and I work in the early 18th to early 19th centuries. So as a historian of the early United States, I tend to orbit more around the American Revolution rather than the Civil War, and I think that gives me an odd or perhaps different relationship to questions of citizenship. In the late 18th century, the term citizen, of course, mattered in terms of thinking about the transition from monarchical subjects to citizens of independent states in a republic, but it was a really poorly defined term. And so as a lot of scholars have pointed out, reading backwards from the 14th Amendment is a mistake. In these early decades after the Revolution, there wasn't a kind of unified legal subject of the US with well-defined rights and duties. And as a kind of revolutionary ideal or term, citizens might have stood in positions of rough equality to each other. But of course, in reality, the world that was created by the American Revolution was laden with customary understandings about hierarchy and privilege. Inequality was a kind of feature and not a bug. So, for example, people might be called citizens, but they didn't have access to the full kind of panoply of rights that today we might associate with citizenship from a modern perspective. And while it was sometimes unclear who citizens were, it was also just as unclear what the kind of content of citizenship was too. So both who citizens were and what citizenship meant, those were problems to be worked out over time, and they weren't clear. That being said, these kind of presumptions about who had membership in the nation did inform whether or not people had a right stay there, to stay within its bounds. And given the kind of indeterminacy of citizenship, I've been interested in the many other ways that people define belonging and political membership in the United States at its beginnings, beyond kind of reflecting on that particular term. So in the first few decades of the early United States, broad ideas about membership in the nation were worked out by proxy through removal, and that's what my work focuses on. So removal meaning this idea that some people belonged within the United States and other people should be actually physically removed from its bounds. In the early decades of the United States, legislators, leaders, reformers, intellectuals, ordinary people, they were all pitching removal as a kind of solution to many of the major problems that still lingered after the American Revolution. Problems and debates that were actually created by the conflict itself. And so they proposed things like restrictive migration statutes that controlled migration between the states, removal treaties that were forced upon indigenous people beginning in the 1780s, colonization schemes, this idea that free African Americans should be physically sent out of the nation to a separate colony, particularly people who had just been emancipated, planned buffer states. And so in this early period, they were often training their eyes and their projects on African Americans and indigenous people when they were thinking about the concept of removal. So removal was really, uniquely important to this post-revolutionary moment because Americans were trying to construct the nation's borders, its territory, its jurisdiction, and really its people for the first time. And so in this period where there wasn't a very clear definition of citizenship, these removal proposals were a more indeterminate means of kind of working out who belonged in the nation, who had the power to move, and really who had the power to remove others. That was the litmus test for belonging in the United States. And so for lots of people, the kind of defining story of this period was about the fight to stay in place. And that struggle to remain had consequences, I think, for the way that understandings of citizenship evolved in the 19th century. And by Reconstruction. So I want to give an example of what I mean by that, this connection between the right to remain and understandings of citizenship. In the early decades of the United States, a lot of states reacted to the growth of Black freedom by limiting mobility and residency for African Americans, placing restrictions on their ability to travel across state borders and remain there. And so those restrictive laws were, putting colonization ideas into action. That was certainly the intent of a Virginia statute that went into effect in 1806 that was supposed to exile newly emancipated people from the state within a year of their emancipation. And then after that Virginia statute went into effect, Maryland, Delaware, other neighboring states quickly followed, the Midwestern states as well in response. And so, by the 18-teens and 1820s, those restrictive migration laws, alongside restrictions on the movement of sailors, initiated this full-scale crisis over free Black rights across state lines. And Black Americans and their white allies were really horrified by these attacks on their ability to travel and move and remain. And I think the acts bring home, first of all, the consequences of decentralization, in which, the states in particular determined so much about the rights that their residents would enjoy. As the states exercised their police powers to exclude free African Americans, they could, in theory, create whole regions where free Black residents were no longer welcome, as many activists, said in the time period, as they pointed out. And so by the antebellum period, citizenship had become this kind of major site of contestation precisely because the states had such different ways of approaching the content and character of citizenship. It wasn't uniform or national, and understanding that it could and should be emerged over time, in part because of these attacks on people's right to remain and on their mobility. Because really, ultimately, what is citizenship but the right to remain? However, clearly, the struggle for the right to remain as a kind of citizenship question looks much different from the perspective of Indigenous history. And so, Greg Oblafsky, I think, talks about how in the nation's founding documents, the term citizen is always posed in contradistinction to Native people. And so in the first decades of the 19th century, when citizenship was kind of extended to some Native people east of the Mississippi River, it was a tool of removal. It was a cutting thing. And the individual states that were hoping to destroy Native sovereignty by breaking up Native land into private property, subjecting individuals to state laws, and racialized and unequal second-class citizenship, that was their kind of one of their modes and one of their tools. And that happened quite quickly in terms of the Cherokees in 1817. Michael Witkin shows how federal officials in Michigan Territory extended U.S. citizenship to mixed-race children of fur traders and Native women as the kind of price for their facilitation of the colonial state and the political economy of plunder. They were the kind of connecting thread of that ongoing colonization. And, in the early 19th century, the people who I write about in my book had no interest or no desire for U.S. citizenship. And so trying to bring that story of citizenship into this time period and place, into many regions of Eastern North America in the early 19th century, in those first decades, really instead reveals how unfitting it is to the stories of so many people. And it reveals alternative stories of power and self-determination, all the things that many Indigenous people did to, nations did to avoid such an outcome. So, for example, one method that some people in the Midwest, where I was looking, did was to protect and project their own nationhood on a kind of global stage by making changes to the way that they conducted diplomacy. So, in a recent essay, John Bickers writes about how Miamia people formed a new national council that was preserving the autonomy of individual villages while creating a kind of unified voice for conducting international diplomacy in the first decades of the 19th century. Some of their Shawnee neighbors were doing similar things at the same time. And so centralization was obviously, contested and uneasy. It was one path among many. Many people objected and made other kinds of choices. But those who pursued it hoped that it would preserve nation-to-nation treaty making with the U.S. and in the face of removal as a kind of national imperative. And so I think that the citizenship narrative feels the most interesting to me when it's actually at its messiest. Trying to make the citizenship idea fit here only shows the kind of contingency of the national form, the national project in North America, and the kind of incomplete settler colonial project in the early 19th century.
Okay. So I want to begin my remarks today by thanking the organizers of this conference. They've given me the opportunity to rethink parts of my own earlier understanding of citizenship, and as we'll see, in ways that resonate with what you've just heard. But I also fully expect my understanding of citizenship to be changed over the course of our conversation over the next day or so. So we all come to our thinking about citizenship from different places. And it's not bad to be self-conscious and explicit about this. So in my own case, my thinking about immigration and citizenship matters has been largely driven by my background as a legal scholar, but also as an immigrant, right? So as all of you know, for close to a century and a half, the constitutional law of immigration and citizenship in the United States has been governed by the so-called plenary power doctrine, right? A doctrine that grounds the federal government's power over naturalization, exclusion, and deportation in sovereignty itself, and that effectively immunizes the federal government's exercise of power in these areas from substantive constitutional review. Thus, beginning with the Chinese exclusion case in the 1880s and heading all the way up to Trump versus Hawaii in our own time, the U.S. Supreme Court has allowed the U.S. government to exclude and to remove immigrants, not only on such bases as poverty, health, or criminal background, which you see in many countries, but also on bases such as race, religion, sexual orientation, political affiliation, and political opinion, all on the ground that the federal government's relationship to legal aliens, as opposed to its relationship to legal citizens, is largely unchecked by the First Amendment, by the Equal Protection Clause, and so on, right? So in the constitutional law of immigration and citizenship, in other words, there's a vast legal gap between the citizen and the alien, formally defined, a gap between territorial rights and territorial rightlessness, such that citizens can claim legal protections against the government, whereas aliens cannot, right? And this is the law today. So the justification for this legal gap between citizen and alien has long been that the federal government, when it deals with immigrants, is dealing with those outside the country or from outside the country, which implicates the United States' relationship with the rest of the world. And this is a legal domain in which the US Supreme Court has declared it is it hesitates to interfere, right? So generations of political theorists have also backed up this legal view by arguing in one way or another that we owe less to those outside the bounds of the polity than we owe to those inside the bounds of the polity. And this is sort of intuitively, at least, familiar, and you hear it said. So these arguments have always been troubling to me, insofar as they justified and sanctioned, even naturalized, as it were, substantive legal discrimination between citizens and aliens. And yet, the logic of the plenary power doctrine, this intuitive idea that we owe less to those outside the country than those inside the country, has incredible staying power, right? So accordingly, in my scholarship, going back to the mid-1990s, and then culminating with this book I wrote in 2015, Making Foreigners, I scanned the historical record for instances in which the citizen-alien distinction, and with it restrictions on legal movement and residence, could not easily be mapped onto who was inside or outside the country, right? And so in the colonial period, for instance, we find legal representations of Native Americans as aliens, right? This is colonial discourse. You can see this. And so these Native Americans in places like Massachusetts in the 17th century, there are instances of them being naturalized as English subjects, which suggests that they were viewed by English colonists as immigrants of a sort outside the community and excludable from or includable into English communities. The antebellum period is also especially revealing. And what I discovered there was a world in which, as we've heard from Samantha, a world in which borders, territorial controls, exclusions, and removals have been wielded against citizens as much as against aliens, particularly when both happened to be poor. At the same time, it was clear that many domestic groups, most notably Native Americans, but also to a much lesser extent free blacks, were legally and formally classified as aliens. And I don't mean just in political discourse, but I mean in the language of the law, right? And so the answer was clear, right? Contrary to the plenary power doctrine, which explained the legal distinction between citizen and alien on the ground that the former were inside the country and the latter outside the country, right? American history shows that those inside the country, including the country's original inhabitants, were not only treated like immigrants when it came to rights to enter and remain within spaces, but had also been legally classified as aliens. So the late 19th century case of Elk versus Wilkins, 1884, which ruled that Native Americans born within tribes were not citizens jure soli under the 14th Amendment, made this point especially clearly, and that is still good law. That case has never been overruled. The Indian Citizenship Act simply extends citizenship by statute, but under the Constitution, Native Americans born within tribes are still not considered citizens, right? So for me, the political lesson of doing all this work was clear. So if groups on the inside, like Native Americans, African Americans, women to a different extent and following a different logic, and the poor had once been treated like foreigners, excluded from and removed from territory, could win citizenship and territorial rights, why not immigrants? The project was, in one sense then, a way of claiming the histories of America's subordinated groups for the purposes of doing right by immigrants, right? That was the sort of project. Why not see the struggles of the dreamers as part of a long line of struggles waged by Native Americans, African Americans, and so on? That was the argument anyway. So I continue to think that is plausible and worthwhile, but I'm also aware that there are problems here, right? And one obvious one is my sort of reliance on this very formal distinction between citizen and alien, which is a legal distinction, rather than thinking about citizenship in more substantive terms. In the world of immigration and citizenship law, the formal legal distinction is obviously very meaningful, right? It can tell you, will you be deported if you get a DUI, yes or no, right? That determines, that will turn on whether you're a citizen or not. So it's not like it doesn't matter. However, to say that African Americans and Native Americans became citizens at different moments in history is to elide the enormous formal gap in terms of the citizen-alien distinction. To elide the enormous gap between the formal citizen legal alien distinction and more substantive understandings, right? Thinking about political rights, welfare rights, and so on. And there are studies that have shown that, in fact, European immigrants did much better under the New Deal than African Americans, right? But there's yet another issue, and this one is more challenging. And this is, in fact, builds upon what you've just heard here. That is that for Native Americans, depending on the moment and the issue, citizenship has been obviously at best a complicated thing. Was it sought after by Native Americans, or was it imposed upon them against their will? As it turns out, both, but more often than not, the latter. What was the relationship between citizenship for Native Americans and Native American sovereignty? Have they been antithetical to one another, or have they been able to coexist, however uneasily? And Supreme Court jurisprudence, of course, shows this work of producing a kind of coexistence between these ideas, right? But it turns out, over the long span of American history, citizenship has been, as we've heard, a tool for limiting Native American sovereignty. So it seems fair to say that as we recognize the anniversary of the Indian Citizenship Act of 1924, Native American history offers a unique insight into the negative potentiality of citizenship. So much of American law and Euro-American political theory treats citizenship as a good, something to be sought after, expanded, enriched, strengthened. If scholars have pointed out how a lack of citizenship has been wielded against immigrants, thereby highlighting the negative uses to which it has been put, they've still not sufficiently interrogated that citizenship or something like it. They've still not interrogated that citizenship is ultimately a desirable thing, right? In its application, we may not realize it, but is it in fact really good? Is it really good? That's not a real debate that happens significantly, I think, in political theory in the US. Native American history, however, does offer us this unique insight into the negative potentiality of citizenship, and hence into the negative potentiality of inclusion itself, right? And so to loop back to where I started, if my work in my book, Making Foreigners, explored how the long span of American history illustrated how foreigners were produced at home and used the struggles of domestic minorities in obtaining citizenship as a way of furthering the struggles of immigrants, delving into Native American history more seriously results in an interrogation, I think, of the imagined telos of immigration, which is citizenship itself, right? Even as the ways in which Native Americans have calibrated citizenship and sovereignty in the 20th century United States might provide us new ways of thinking about immigration itself. So this could be a very different history of immigration and citizenship. What could it look like? One can imagine so many different connections waiting to be made, linking Native Americans perhaps to loyalists, right? Linking Native Americans to many immigrants and citizens who at one point or another, for one reason or another, have refused the embrace of citizenship and the embrace perhaps of America itself. And what are the challenges that such a history might pose to our basic political theories of citizenship? Thank you.
I want to thank our panelists for their excellent presentations, and I want to take a few minutes to ask them some of my own questions first, because I'm the moderator, I get to do that. And then we'll throw it out to you guys, okay? So I would like to start, one of the things that I found in common for all of your presentations, and I think is quite interesting, is that all of you point out this very important relationship between citizen and the state, whether it's indigenous, Black, woman, citizen in general. And so I'm interested to know what your work has taught you about the evolution of that relationship between the citizens you've studied and the state, what it looked like then versus now. Has there been any kind of evolution at all? I don't care. Go ahead.
I mean, in my research, I primarily look at the Southwest. So I think that the political evolution of citizenship in the Southwest is very different from in the Northeast or in the Great Lakes or other places. I don't think that there are models that apply everywhere. Like, I don't think that Wittgen's, the theory of political plunder with Native peoples works in Arizona and New Mexico in the same way. And so I guess by extension, what I'm saying is that what I've done in my work is looking at previous nation states and how they've handled citizenship and seeing that evolution over time in a place like Arizona and New Mexico, where first there's Spain, it's part of New Spain, and then it's independent Mexico, and Spain moved towards liberalization and giving citizenship to Native peoples during sort of its later years as it was reaching its sort of imperial twilight, or one of them, because it went through several. But then Mexico universally declared Native people citizens, and what I've seen there, and what I think is the case, kind of back to your comments, is that anytime citizenship is granted for Native peoples, it is to take away indigenous land and rights. I mean, there's no other purpose. It's never been to give them an equal footing. It's been proposed in those terms. And so, even, if you look at the red progressives and during the late 19th and early 20th century, even Native peoples who supported Indian citizenship, even they stated it in terms of Native peoples need to be fully incorporated into the body politic. Well, why do you want full incorporation for Native peoples? It's because they don't when that happens, they don't have a distinctive status as indigenous peoples who are parts of indigenous nations. And this is sort of where the idea of citizenship for Native peoples born on reservations cannot be, because those are sovereign nations. I mean, you don't make treaties with peoples who are not other nations, and so then they can't have citizenship by that. So sort of this convoluted thought to bring it all back together. This is what happened with Spain. This is what happened with Mexico in particular. The only intent for granting full citizenship to indigenous peoples for those imperial nations was to eliminate Native people status so that then their land is open. And I also point out that before 1924, we think of Indian citizenship, the Act grants birthright citizenship to, the population of Native peoples at that time was 300,000 plus in the United States. This is a relatively small number. 2/3 of Native peoples already had citizenship before 1924. How? Through allotment, meaning through tribal lands being taken away and the breakup of tribal land holdings and the erosion of tribal sovereignty. And so citizenship, for me, it's always to take away indigenous sovereignty and rights. And I don't think it can ever be seen as a positive good. Maybe on an individual case, and there are Native peoples who sometimes are held up in that way, like Carlos Montezuma or other, various red progressives in particular who gain citizenship and then use, their political voice. But then I've written the most recent article I had published was how fundamentally Carlos Montezuma and his cousin Mike Burns was the first Native person in Arizona to gain citizenship. He was a veteran. He had been an Indian scout. They had absolutely terrible lives later on. Like I think that citizenship actually proved to be probably one of the worst things that had happened to them. So I'll stop there. I've talked long. Man.
Sorry. No, I mean, I'll just add briefly that I think speaking again from the earlier period, the contrast between the way that many federal leaders were talking about Native incorporation into the polity versus African American incorporation into the polity is always really telling. Conversations about incorporation of Native peoples was always about territoriality and territory. And so there was, that was why that assumption was kind of baked into the way that many federal leaders were writing about this, and then state leaders during the removal era. So I would just add that as a little addendum, that the comparison I think is useful.
Mm-hmm. So I'm just going to add as a thought, which is that it's hard to answer that question without asking that citizenship matters in very different ways at different moments, right? And we actually see the post-New Deal state is a very different kind of entity that plays a very different kind of role in people's lives. And so the extent that citizenship is linked to a whole range of benefits and privileges in the second half of the 20th century makes it much more potent for lots of different people, right? I mean, the 19th century looks very different. So I think you would really need to say sort of what kinds of questions are we asking here, and about what group, in order to think seriously through what citizenship actually means. That's what I would say.
I do want to talk a little bit. Go ahead. Yes.
I see one saving grace in the Indian Citizenship Act of 1924 is that it allowed tribal citizens to retain tribal citizenship. That it had always been a prerequisite previous to that you had to reject your citizenship within your tribal nation. With the Citizenship Act of 1924, you could retain. I mean, the wording is that all those born within the territorial limits become citizens of the United States and don't have to relinquish an interest in tribal property. That's what it's saying. So in other words, you could still live on a reservation. You could still live on trust land and be part of the tribal community. That's the only saving grace of Indian citizenship that I see.
We'll call it a saving. Yeah.
Right. Although, I mean, I just want to throw one very, very, very small wrench into that, which is to say, because the case Elk versus Wilkins itself involves someone who was born in a reservation. Mm-hmm. He leaves the reservation. He tries to vote, and he's denied the right.
Yeah.
And he's denied the right. The Supreme Court says, for you to be an Indian born in a reservation is the equivalent of being a French person born in France.
Right.
And that intuitively is also not okay. Right? So
you have to be naturalized.
Right. So you're sort of, if for Native American sovereignty citizenship issues, these are really, you don't actually either want to sort of screw over the person who wants to vote.
But then the person that I could bring up is Mike Burns, who I just mentioned is the first Native citizen, the first Indigenous person who gained citizenship in Arizona. He was born before it was a reservation. So, and he had no problem getting his citizenship during that same period. So, it's never that hard and fast as well. Even, Supreme Court decisions notwithstanding, there are various ways and means for Native peoples to gain citizenship, even when they are reservation born. I think it depends much more on the state and the municipality, how racist it is, how much it wants to disenfranchise Native peoples.
When we talk about citizenship, one of the things, and this is something that's currently a hot topic of discussion, citizenship is very much about identity and ownership of that identity. And at the turn of the century, when there are all of these groups, whether we're talking about the Indian Citizenship Act or we're talking about the women's suffrage movement, there is a lot of pushback against that, right? With the establishment of the Daughters of the American Revolution, the Sons of the American Revolution, the Daughters of the Confederacy, grandsons of the whoever and all of this claiming to a native born, I have roots here and all of that. Can we talk a little bit about what that means to citizenship and identity and what that is to the pushback on people who are trying to claim these so-called benefits of, if there is any, to citizenship? Okay. It's a hot topic, Maurice. Yeah, you're a desert person.
I am, but it's still like that heat is built into it. It comes out. Okay, so now I sort of forgot the question.
It's like native, like
Sure. Okay. So where I see this most on display is when there are land disputes in the West. Like when those militia people took over the national monument, or ranchers in places like Nevada and the Four Corners area, and they often frame their arguments around, my grandpappy was on this. We've been on this land for 4 generations. And this actually just came up, and I was sort of joking. Brenda and I were talking before and people were saying like, yeah, well, my ancestor lived in this same Dutch village for 400 years. And I was like, well, my ancestors came out of a hole in our ancestral lands in time immemorial. We've been here forever. And those things don't register. They don't hold water, I guess. And what people don't understand that. And when it comes to Western land in particular, and we're talking about grazing, and we're talking about, like access to what would be ancestral sites for people who want to run their cattle along those sites, people often say, we've had this grazing permit in our family for 4, 5, 6 generations. And it should be sort of like a mic drop moment when I say, yeah, but my ancestors ascended from a hole in the ground on that same place in time immemorial, but it never is. And so I think that this speaks to different epistemologies and different ways of seeing the land itself, access, like Western forms see and are connected to citizenship and sort of a sense of being of a place for a certain amount of time. But when it comes to Native peoples, those ways of being and living and being part of the land don't really, they just don't count. They don't seem to count.
I mean, although I would say that that's true for Native people, and it's true for lots of other movement groups, right? The immigration reform folk in the late 19th and 20th centuries. Anytime you see these arguments about, ownership and ancestry, what they're actually trying to do is denigrate the claims of not people outside the country, but actually people who are very much here, right? And that's what was going on then with Italians, for instance, didn't belong in the country the way that people of Northwestern European stuff did, right? Or when you see politicians today, what they're denigrating is the claims of Latinos, and right. So it's not about people not here. It's about people very much here who are being told that their claims are somehow spurious or not as valid or not as etc.
Samantha? Okay. I do want to ask this one last question, and then we'll throw it out to the audience, and that is, has your definition of citizenship changed since you first started your work? I like that you look at, I don't have the answer.
Yeah, absolutely. Sure. I mean, if there are some sort of ironies or contradictions built into the indigenous experience in the United States. One is that you will find some of like the biggest patriotism in Native communities, which is it's hard for me sometimes to understand that. There's a very strong military tradition as well. And a lot of people say, well, okay, it connects to like sort of a previous warrior culture and a desire to defend homelands. but in the end, you're still sort of fighting for the colonizer, right? And I grew up, with relatives who were veterans. The highest rates of military service are within Native communities in the United States, higher than any other demographic, sometimes significantly so. And so I went through a political transformation, maybe like a sort of radicalization, although I wouldn't say that I'm, all that radical, but sometimes even within my own family, like I've said at times, I'm not patriotic. And I've had relatives who, what? You're not patriotic, but your grandfather was on Iwo Jima, and he was friends with Ira Hayes. They grew up together. And I'm just like, yeah, I'm not particularly patriotic. And I think that goes to ways that I see citizenship as well. I love Deb Haaland, but I would never wear a shirt that says voting is sacred. And I would also never try to shame somebody who didn't vote or convince them why they should, an Indigenous person, because I see that rejection as a political act and it's just as powerful as going to the polls. And I don't think that, Native people shouldn't vote. But I think that's one view of citizenship for me that has altered significantly. I grew up hearing these stories about people who, like Miguel Trujillo in New Mexico or Frank Harrison, Harry Austin in Arizona, who were Native peoples who went and fought for the right to vote. And I still think that there's much to admire in those people, but I don't think about it in the same way, certainly, because I don't see citizenship of the vote in the same way.
I mean, I think that my understanding has become much more flexible and much less teleological. And, particularly influential for me has been the work of people like Martha Jones and Chris Bonner and Derek Spires, who think about, citizenship as something that had to be defined by ordinary people and not just by people with power over time. And so as as aspiring social historian, I guess, as someone who wants to be a social historian, I think I find that work to be really incredible. The ways that people were defining citizenship on their own when some states were saying that they were not citizens and some were. So the way that people just put citizenship into practice every day.
So I would echo that. I would say as well that for me, I'm very attentive to the fact that citizenship has many, many, many different meanings, right? It has legal meanings. It's used in political discourse. It's used in cultural discourse. It's used in novels. So it really, and it's imagined, right, by people from whom it has been withheld, who've brought in new legal and political kinds of citizenship. They brought them into being, but it isn't one thing. And I think that, there are very influential histories about the movement of citizenship, right? T.H. Marshall's essay about civil, political, social citizenship. So it's really all over the map, right? There isn't a sort of stable concept. And so it makes more sense for me to think, what is it that I'm trying to do with citizenship as a way of clarifying the kinds of answers that I can think about.
Excellent. Let's open it up to the floor. Does anybody have any questions for our wonderful panel? Oh, a very exciting question. Hi.
Hi. So as a Black woman who by birth has had citizenship in this country, but also lived as an immigrant in the UK for a lot of my life, I've had a lot of questions, and I came into this conference wanting to ask the questions that have really bugged me of why both governments have been hesitant to legitimize and protect my rights, whether I was a citizen or not. In reading more of the papers, preparing for this Congress and listening to all of you, I realized that I'm not the only one here for professional reasons and to be a nerd, but also to ask those personal questions. I wonder, as you've been looking at the scholarship that will be presented tomorrow and also learning about your fellow panelists and their lives and their work, if there are any questions that are kind of pricking in your brain that you're hoping to get the answers to over the next day.
My question is always how to put these really different histories into conversation with each other, because citizenship has such radically different meanings depending on who we're talking about. There are many different people who have been excluded from the nation for incredibly different reasons that are often incomparable. And so I actually, like in my own work, I shied away from the conversation about citizenship because I wasn't sure how to make these things speak to each other. So I think that's the question that I've always had, and the one that I'm hoping to answer here is how to put these things into conversation in a way that actually does justice to the unique histories that we're talking about.
One thing question that I have and that I'm grappling with in my own work. My work now focuses on Apaches and Yavapais men who served as Army Scouts during the late 19th century primarily. If you look at citizenship movements in the 20th century, they're frequently pushed forward by veterans. It's sort of like the element that you need if you want to move the needle. With Indian citizenship, it was veterans. It was World War I veterans coming home from service, and like the first Citizenship Act for veterans, which was very imperfect, then leads to another one in 1924. But these guys who I study were all veterans basically, and they got pensions. They helped sort of change the narrative with neighboring communities. There's always this idea of like, well, I don't like you, I'm racist against your people, but you're okay if you were a veteran, and there's something about that why is the power of military service in the United States so strong, especially when it comes to citizenship and ethnic minorities or various immigrant groups? The United States hates Black, brown, various groups, but it loves putting them in the military. Like we won't grant you any of the the so-called citizen rights, but we'll sure as hell take you into our military. So that's a question that I always like perplexes me, and that I'd like to have more discussion. I mean, there's plenty of it already, but just to talk about more.
Keep going. Just thinking about what you were just saying, Maurice, too, it's so ironic that that's the case in the U.S., even though there was not supposed to be a standing army in this country. But so I do have two questions for you, Maurice. I mean, thank you so much. All of these papers were so interesting.
Why did we have a standing army eventually? Because indigenous armies beat the United States so badly that we needed.
And you can read about that in Sam's book. So I had one question, which is about, I really like that point that you ended on about how it might be one of the ways forward might be to kind of reinforce tribal sovereignty alongside citizenship. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit, there was a lot of conversation the past couple of years about the possibility of Cherokee delegates to to Congress, and just if you can think of other sort of mechanisms where there could be a different kind of political, I don't want to say inclusion, right? But like some way of having structures of tribal, like nation to nation government that would run alongside or reinforce or complement citizenship that you could see. Maybe the delegates is kind of an obvious one. And then a second question, you kind of touched on this before your talk, or in the beginning of your talk, when you were talking about the absentee ballots, and you have a kind of sort of minoritarian experience of being somebody who has a reservation community and grew up on a reservation. Most Native people today don't have that, obviously. So could you, and I was thinking about what Kunal was talking about with inside outside, right? Like, is there a way that you can say a little bit about a bit of, I don't know if you want to use the word diaspora, but this kind of diasporic tribal citizenship and people who don't necessarily have the same kind of, they don't necessarily feel the consequences of like tribal elections as closely as people who are living there. I mean, there's obviously ways that they do still. What is that like in terms of bringing people back for elections and absentee ballots? I just think it'd be really interesting to hear a little bit more about that.
First question, I think it would require sort of like an entire reordering of the system that oversees Indian affairs in the United States. I mean, with our current structure, I don't know how you're going to make that happen. Because even if, Cherokee Nation has a delegate to Congress, like, okay, a non-voting delegate, right? Yeah, I mean, I get the symbolic value. Absolutely, it's important. But could we move more towards sort of like a confederated United States where indigenous nations operate within the larger federal political system as nations still? I mean, what government to government relationships often means is that every year the president has a tribal leaders summit and they bring the tribal leaders to Washington. And, I remember when my mom was so excited about that because she got to go meet Obama. Oh my gosh, but beyond that, those things are largely symbolic. And I think that even saying a government to government relationship for most tribal nations, what's the most important part of that? It's being able to have a gaming compact and start a casino that will then drive the community in ways that other things don't or historically haven't. I mean, if you look at ours before the early 1990s when we opened our casino and our community after, it's night and day. I mean, I wouldn't have gotten a PhD if it wasn't for that money. Well, that goes back to native land, trust land being exempt from state law, and Indian gaming. But I don't see any, like, I couldn't say, well, if we did this, there's these three things that we could do and that it would greatly increase tribal sovereignty. Because even if we moved in that direction, the Supreme Court is eroding tribal sovereignty, and now in the form of environmental protections, which are really important for tribal communities. Like our tribe lives at the site of a giant slag heap that is the remnants of mine tailings from the early 20th century. So I don't mean to be particularly like sort of negative or bleak, but I think there are ways, but I think that we need sort of a rethinking of Indian affairs in general and the Bureau of Indian Affairs itself. And then to your second question, this idea of indigenous communities being, more Native peoples live off reservation today than on. Of our tribal citizenship, I think like 700 live on reservation, and then the other of 2,600, almost 2,000 live off reservation, some of them out of state or out of the country. I don't live on reservation. I live in Phoenix, but I can go to an election when I need to because it's an hour and a half up the street, and I go vote at home, and I don't have to do an absentee ballot. But I think that some tribes, I think, are better at making tribal members feel more part of the community and the body politic, the tribal body politic, as it were. But again, if we go back to sort of colonial forms of belonging and what is the main way to determine tribal citizenship today for most communities is through blood quantum. So again, that's a way of excluding. The two great examples of racial belonging in the United States are the one-drop rule and blood quantum. Like one is to put as many people into that category as you can, and the other is to take as many people out of that category as you can, because then you open up their land and resources to exploitation and colonization. I guess that's all I can say. I wish that tribal communities would be more inclusive in their citizenship statutes. I know a lot of people who, for example, siblings who are tribal citizens, like the older ones are and the younger ones aren't, because one was born before the Indian Gaming and Regulatory Act and the other was born after. And those tribes pulled, their citizenship statutes, made them significantly more strict, because the idea is the pie doesn't have enough slices to go around when you have that kind of money. So anyway, sorry to be a downer, but I run hot. What can I say?
We might have time for one more question. Sure.
Thank you all for this presentation. And I'm thinking about citizenship now as a category analysis that maybe isn't helpful for historians. So the question I would like to propose is, we've heard from Kunal about the negative potentiality of citizenship. And then I'm thinking about removal for Samantha Seeley's work. So what other kinds of analytics might be more useful when we think about Black, Latinx, trans people historically who refused citizenship? They don't care about it. In the archive, they write about living in a different world where that doesn't exist. So then as scholars, what kind of analytics should we be utilizing alongside, or rather indifferent to citizenship, that might help us see a more fuller picture of the past?
No.
It's a really good question. And my historian's cop-out is going to be, I want to know what languages you're referring to be able to think through what people have said, right? One of the things that I will say is, I think it was a couple of years ago, there's a whole border abolition movement, right, which is actually going on to some extent within the United States. I think it's a little bit stronger in Europe. More European academics, intellectuals, and others are thinking about this. And I do think, so while I'm sympathetic to the project, I actually think that borders serve so many functions right now that are so tied up to so many important parts of people's lives that I think, abolition from one moment to the next is not actually a solution that most people are going to be able to live with. And I would say the same about citizenship, right? Which is that I think there's a lot tied up with the concept. And so I would be interested in thinking about alternatives, but I don't want to pretend that it's not enormously important. So.
First of all, thank our panelists for a wonderful panel and for all of the things that they have shared with us. But I also would like to encourage all of you, when you go to panels tomorrow, to think about everything that they've said and the questions that you might carry into the panels you attend tomorrow. What does citizenship mean to you, and all of the different ways that citizenship can be interpreted, who's included, and more importantly, who's not included? And what does that mean in the work that we do outside of this conference? My thanks once again to the Massachusetts Historical Society. Thank you all for attending, and thank you to our online audience for joining us. Have a wonderful evening, everyone. Thank you all so much.